Ron Howard has spent more than 60 years inside the film industry, first as a child actor on television, and later as one of Hollywood's most respected directors. Few people alive have watched the machinery of American movie stardom operate from as many angles as he has. He grew up inside the studio system's afterglow, worked alongside actors who had lived through its golden age, and eventually became a historian of sorts, someone who has spoken publicly, over the decades, about how fame in that era often masked cruelty rather than character. This is not a story about scandal for its own sake. It is a look at 6 actors whose off-screen conduct, documented across court records, contemporaneous news coverage, memoirs, and on-the-record interviews from people who knew them, stood in sharp contrast to the images the studios sold to the public. Some of what follows is settled legal history. Some of it is disputed allegation that deserves to be treated as such. All of it says something about an industry that, for decades, built its brightest stars on very little accountability. Errol Flynn was Hollywood's original swashbuckler, a Tasmanian-born actor who became an overnight star after Captain Blood in 1935. Warner Brothers built an empire on his athleticism and charisma, casting him in one adventure picture after another through the late 1930s and early 1940s. In 1942, Flynn's public image collided with a criminal case that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was charged with statutory rape after 2 teenage girls, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen, accused him of assault. The trial, held in early 1943, became a media sensation, with newspapers across the country covering it in detail. Flynn was acquitted by the jury, a verdict that came after his defense team aggressively challenged the credibility of both accusers. The acquittal did little to settle the matter in the public imagination. The phrase, unlike Flynn, entered American slang partly because of the trial's notoriety. Contemporary newspaper coverage shows a media environment split between defending Flynn as a victim of opportunistic accusers and quietly acknowledging that his lifestyle off-camera bore little resemblance to the gallant heroes he played on screen. Warner Brothers spent heavily on his legal defense, aware that an actor of Flynn's box office value represented too large an investment to abandon, a calculation historians often point to as an early, clear example of how the studio system prioritized commercial protection over scrutiny of an actor's private conduct. Flynn's personal decline in the years that followed is well documented. Biographers and contemporaries described a worsening dependence on alcohol and, in his later years, heroin. His health deteriorated steadily through the 1950s. He died in Vancouver in 1959 at age 50. The coroner's report cited heart failure, along with liver and other organ damage consistent with years of substance abuse. His posthumously published memoir and later biographies, including Charles Hyams' controversial 1980 book, added further claims about his personal life, some of which remain contested by historians. What is not contested is that Flynn's public trial and the studio's aggressive effort to protect its investment in him illustrate how the star system could mobilize enormous resources to shield an actor from consequence. By the time of his death, Flynn had appeared in more than 50 films, but obituaries in 1959 already noted the widening gap between his on-screen legend and the increasingly public record of his personal excesses, a gap that would only grow larger as later biographies and his own posthumously published memoir, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, added further detail to the picture. Kirk Douglas was born Isser Danielovich in 1916 to Belarusian Jewish immigrant parents in Amsterdam, New York, and built a career defined by intensity, both on screen and, according to many who work with him, off it. His performances in films like Champion, Ace in the Hole, and Spartacus made him one of the defining leading men of the post-war era. Colleagues across decades described Douglas as a demanding, sometimes volatile presence on set. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him in Paths of Glory and Spartacus, spoke in later interviews about Douglas's relentless drive and his difficulty ceding creative control. These accounts describe a perfectionism that could tip into harshness toward crew members, a pattern several colleagues corroborated over the years in separate interviews and memoirs. Douglas himself did not shy away from this reputation. In his own 1988 autobiography, The Ragman Son, he wrote candidly about his temper and his difficulty trusting collaborators, framing it as the byproduct of a childhood defined by poverty and instability. Actors and directors who worked with him across decades, including Burt Lancaster, his frequent co-star and occasional rival, describe a relationship that mixed genuine respect with real friction, and several accounts describe Douglas as someone who could be generous with younger actors one day and coldly dismissive the next. A more serious and disputed claim surfaced only after Douglas's death in 2020 at age 103. In her 2018 memoir, Natalie Wood's sister Lana alleged that Douglas assaulted Natalie in the 1950s when she was a teenager, a claim Lana had made in earlier interviews as well. Douglas was never charged, and the allegation rests on Lana, Wood's account rather than corroborating physical evidence or contemporaneous police records. It should be understood as a serious but unproven allegation, not an established fact. It resurfaced repeatedly in the years after Natalie Wood's 1981 death, part of a broader reckoning with how the industry handled the vulnerability of young performers who, like Wood, had been working steadily since early childhood under contracts that gave studios and adult colleagues enormous influence over their lives. Douglas addressed neither the allegation directly in his later public appearances nor faced any legal proceeding connected to it, and his family has continued to dispute the characterization. The episode is best understood as an unresolved and contested claim that nonetheless became part of the broader public conversation about accountability in the industry during the #MeToo era, when many decades-old allegations against powerful men resurfaced for renewed scrutiny. Faye Dunaway's career reached its peak in the late 1960s and 1970s with performances in Bonnie and Clyde and Chinatown that established her as one of the era's most formidable actresses. Her professional reputation, however, became inseparable from stories about her conduct on set. The production of Mommy Dearest in 1981, in which Dunaway played Joan Crawford, became a particular flashpoint. Director Frank Perry and various crew members later described a difficult, contentious shoot marked by clashes over Dunaway's approach to the role. The film itself, intended as a serious biographical drama, was received by audiences and critics largely as camp, and its troubled reputation followed Dunaway for years. Reports of on-set friction continued to surface across her later career, including widely reported accounts from productions of Network, The Wicked Lady, and a 2019 stage production of Tea at 5, from which Dunaway was dismissed amid public disputes over her conduct toward crew members. By the 2010s, industry commentary had shifted from treating these stories as anecdotes to treating them as a documented pattern affecting her casting prospects. Dunaway herself has periodically disputed specific characterizations in the press, and it is worth noting that much of this reporting comes from unnamed sources or second-hand accounts rather than sworn testimony. A 2024 documentary about her career, in which Dunaway participated directly, addressed the reputation head-on, with Dunaway acknowledging that her intensity and perfectionism on set had at times crossed into behavior she regretted, while also pushing back on what she described as a double standard applied to demanding women in an industry that tolerated and often celebrated the same behavior in male directors and stars. That documentary is itself a useful reminder that the record on Dunaway is not simply illicit accusations. It includes her own reflection on the criticism. John Wayne, born Marion Morrison in Iowa in 1907, became the most durable symbol of American masculinity that the studio system ever produced. Across a career spanning the 1930s through the 1970s, he embodied the Western hero and, by extension, a particular vision of national identity. Unlike the other figures in this story, Wayne's most damaging public record is not a court case, but his own words. In a widely cited May 1971 interview with Playboy magazine, Wayne made statements about Native Americans and Black Americans that were, even by the standards of the time, sharply criticized and remain difficult to read today. He argued that land claimed by Native Americans should have gone to those who could work it, and made comments dismissing the pace of civil rights progress that many contemporaries and later historians characterized as overtly racist. The interview is a primary source, not a second-hand allegation, and it remains one of the most cited documents when scholars discuss the gap between Wayne's public image and his personal views. On set, colleagues including directors John Ford and Howard Hawks described Wayne as commanding and at times difficult, particularly when he disagreed with directors' creative choices, as reportedly happened during production of The Searchers. Wayne's political activism extended well beyond interviews. He was a founding member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization that supported the Hollywood blacklist era investigations, and he served as president of the Screen Actors Guild during a period when the industry was actively purging suspected communist sympathizers from its ranks, a chapter of Hollywood history that ended careers and, in some documented cases, contributed to the suicides of blacklisted performers and writers. Wayne died of cancer in 1979 at age 72. His legacy remains genuinely contested. To many, he is still an emblem of a certain American self-image. To others, his own recorded statements and his role in the blacklist era complicate any uncritical celebration of that image. Roman Polanski's case is the most legally unambiguous of the six. Born in Paris in 1933 to a family that endured the Holocaust in Poland, Polanski built an internationally acclaimed directing career with films, including Rosemary's Baby and, later, Chinatown. In March 1977, Polanski was arrested after a photography session with a 13-year-old girl at Jack Nicholson's Los Angeles home. He was charged with multiple offenses and, as part of a plea agreement, pleaded guilty to unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. Before his sentencing was finalized, Polanski fled the United States in 1978 and has not returned. He has continued his directing career in Europe, remaining a fugitive from American justice, and won the Academy Award for Best Director for The Pianist in 2003, an outcome that drew significant public criticism at the time. In 2020, Francis Cesar Awards drew protests in a walkout when Polanski won Best Director for An Officer and a Spy, reflecting an ongoing and unresolved public reckoning with how the industry treats his work relative to his crime. Polanski's legal team has argued for decades that irregularities in the original sentencing process, including alleged improper communications between the judge and the media, justifies continued refusal to return to the United States, an argument that has been considered and rejected by multiple courts over the years. Additional allegations from other women, spanning different decades and countries, have surfaced since 2017, though most fall outside applicable statutes of limitations and have not resulted in further criminal charges. This is the one case among the six where the central fact, a guilty plea to a sexual offense against a minor, is not in dispute, even as the surrounding legal and procedural questions remain the subject of ongoing argument. Mickey Rooney, born Joseph Hill Jr. in 1920, was Hollywood's first major child star and, by his late teens, the highest-paid actor in the United States, built by MGM into the image of wholesome American youth through the Andy Hardy films and a string of musicals opposite Judy Garland. Rooney's personal life told a different story. He married 8 times, and several of those marriages ended amid public acrimony. His second wife, actress Ava Gardner, later described him in blunt terms in her memoirs. His friendship and working relationship with Judy Garland during their MGM years has been the subject of extensive biographical study, much it focused less on Rooney's direct treatment of her, and more on how the studio system, including punishing schedules and pressure over her weight and appearance, damaged Garland during the years the two worked together. Rooney's later life was marked by financial collapse, having earned and lost a fortune many times over, and by a widely publicized 2011 case in which he testified before the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging about elder abuse. He said he suffered at the hands of family members who controlled his finances. He died in 2014 at age 93, his estate reportedly worth a small fraction of what he had earned across a 7-decade career. His story, more than the others here, is as much about how the studio system consumed a child star as it is about harm he caused others, though contemporaries did describe him as a volatile and difficult colleague through much of his career. Biographers have noted that MGM studio chief Louis B. Mayer built much of Rooney's early stardom on a manufactured image of clean-cut, small-town wholesomeness that bore little resemblance to Rooney's actual adolescence, which was marked by early acts as alcohol, gambling, and adult relationships that the studio's publicity machine worked hard to keep out of press. Rooney's later account of his own life, in interviews in his 1991 memoir, Life is Too Short, described a performer who understood from a very young age that his value to the studio was entirely tied to an image he did not recognize as his own. None of these 6 men and women are identical cases, and it would be a disservice to flatten them into a single narrative. Polanski's guilt is a matter of legal record. The allegation against Kirk Douglas rests on one family member's account, made decades after the fact, and was never tested in court. Wayne's most damning evidence is his own recorded voice. Dunaway's reputation rests largely on repeated, unnamed source reporting about workplace conduct. Flynn was acquitted by a jury even as the trial itself exposed how thoroughly a studio would mobilize to protect its investment. Rooney's story blurs the line between perpetrator and product of a system that exploited children for profit. What connects them is not a uniform verdict, but a common structural fact. The studio system of Hollywood's golden age had enormous financial incentive and often the practical power to manage public perception of its stars regardless of their private conduct. Publicists, legal teams, and friendly press relationships could soften scandal, delay reckonings for decades, or bury allegations entirely. Ron Howard, who came up through that industry as a child actor before becoming one of its most consistently well-regarded directors, has spoken at various points across his career about the distance between the glamorous image the old studio system projected and the more complicated, sometimes troubling reality behind it. The point of revisiting these 6 stories now is not to render final judgment on each individual, since the underlying evidence varies enormously in strength from case to case. It is to look honestly at how fame was manufactured, protected, and sometimes weaponized during an era still remembered in shorthand as golden. Modern film scholarship increasingly treats that shorthand with skepticism, not to erase the genuine artistic achievements of the period, but to insist that the achievements and the abuses can and should be discussed in the same breath. Understanding how thoroughly the industry once protected its stars from consequence is, in many ways, a useful lens for evaluating how much or how little has actually changed since. Which of these 6 stories surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments.